your name and the name of the institution. Thank you.
My name is Carol Lee, and I'm from Northwestern University.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for being here with us and for agreeing to give us this interview. I would like to begin by asking you to share some of the ways in which culture importantly shows up in your work as an educational researcher.
I would say that culture is central to all of the work that I do in educational research and practice, in large part because I understand that culture is central to human functioning, and so that if we want to have valid understandings of how people learn, why people learn, what people learn, what kind of choices people make, even how organizations run for that matter, it's always going to be situated in the context of cultural practices.
Thank you. And can you please elaborate on this and in terms of how it's closely related to CREA's focus on assessment and evaluation?
Well, as I said in the talk that I just gave, in terms of education, assessment, whether it's assessments of learning or evaluations of educational programs, have grave consequences, particularly in the policy world, where decisions are made about competence of young people, for example, or the effectiveness of programs that are intended to help young people learn. The extent to which the tools that we use are not sufficiently nuanced to be able to capture the multiple ways and pathways through which people display competence suggests to me that our findings are inevitably going to be limited. Much of what happens, I think, in the assessment world in particular now ends up categorizing large numbers of young people as incompetent when especially if you look at a lot of the work that's done in informal learning outside of school, it's always an interesting and ironic dilemma of young people who are failing in school by virtue of assessments that have categorized them in that way. And then these same young people walk out of the doors of that school building and engage in very complex problem solving that often involves some of the same domains of knowledge that they're flunking in school. So I think that it is both a central problem of practice to think about how to address the breadth and complexities of people's participation in cultural practices in assessment and evaluation, and that has a significant impact on trajectories and opportunities for learning.
Thank you. Could you now please describe the meanings or dimensions of culture that are most central to your own work, or expand on it?
I think that my friend Chris Gutierrez talks about the stereotype of what she calls the box problem in thinking about culture. And that is either the idea that culture is defined solely by, for example, ethnicity, as opposed to thinking of culture as a set of beliefs and practices that persist over time, but also have the dimensions of emergence and change over time, and that people inevitably participate in multiple cultural communities. So if I'm a video game aficionado, that is a cultural community that actually goes across time and space. For myself, I'm an officially elderly African American woman, and I belong to a cultural community that is defined, that is encompassed by my ethnicity, but I also have cultural practices that are associated with my age cohort, that are associated with my gender, that are associated with my being a member of the learning sciences community, professional community in the field of education. As a mother, when I meet young women who are having their first child, I tell them I'm welcome you to the one universal sisterhood, right? And so I belong to all of these various cultural communities. They all involve different aspects of my identity, different commitments that I make, and that give me access to different kinds of spaces and invite me into different kinds of practices. I'm also very interested in the ways in which culture and human biology are dynamically intertwined, such that there are dispositions that we have because we are human beings, that our evolutionary history, rooted in large part in our biology, drives us to be social, drives us to want to interact with other human beings, drives us to want to look for patterns and regularities in experiences. That evolution also drives emotion as being very salient in how we make sense of experiences. And although these are dispositions, if you will, that are made possible, if you will, because of our biology, it is specifically our participation in cultural practices that shapes how we use these dispositions, what functions they serve. And so I try to think about culture as existing as being multidimensional, as being nuanced, as being dynamic. And I recognize that complexity is difficult in terms of our role as researchers. It's difficult to get a handle on it as measurable, if you will. And I don't know of research designs or methodologies that are necessarily going to capture all of those dimensions, but the complexity is there. And the issue is, if we are sufficiently aware of the range of that complexity, I think we're more likely to try to conceptualize, for example, research designs or pose research questions that are going to try to get a little handle, if you will, on as much of that complexity as possible, as opposed to ignoring it and assuming that what we find out is somehow generalizable or ecologically valid.
Thank you. The core mission of CREA is to generate evidence for policy making that is not only methodologically but also culturally and contextually defensible. Could you please describe the ways in which your current work connects to CREA's mission? And you alluded to many of those already, but if you want to expand.
I think that policymakers are interested in impact. And I would argue that for persons, and I think this would be the case for CREA, in terms of evaluation and assessment, that it should, in order to impact policy, it needs to have measures of both outcomes and processes. And because in the absence, with attention solely to outcomes, if the outcomes are not what you're looking for, then you don't have any explanatory power for why that's the case or how you might change it. And so process variables in particular, I think, are always going to be rooted in the cultural. That is, they're going to be rooted in interactions that human beings have with one another, have with artifacts, have with structures in organizations, for example. And so to the extent I think that CREA focuses on the development and support of tools that address both process and outcome in ways that are responsive to the complex demands of different kinds of settings. then I think it's in a much better position to speak to the world of policy, and including helping helping the policy community, which itself is a broad and diverse community, to recognize that if they're going to accomplish the outcome goals of interest, they've got to have a broad, I'm going to call it sort of ecological focus. So, for example, in the a presentation that I had just given, where we were looking at international assessment data with PISA and PEARLS, PISA with 15-year-olds, PEARLS with fourth graders, that they did an analysis of those factors in societies that contributed to the success of poor children in a number of nations in the world in ways that are very different from the United States. And it has to do with, if you will, sort of process inputs in terms of supports for young people. But our, at least largely at the government level, I would say, whether it's federal or state or school district level, have not, I think, been able to conceptualize the importance of having inputs to a broad ecology, early childhood education, the nature of how we support and develop teachers' attention to health care, the ways in which these are all intimately connected as complex systems, and that complex systems are indeed cultural systems, so that the extent to which CREA could sort of expand, if you will, the vision that policymakers have of the aspects of the world that their policies have to address to achieve the outcomes of interest, I think that would be another major contribution of CREA.
Great, beautiful. How do you see your own future work interfacing with CREA and connecting to its mission?
Well, I have two issues, I would say, two projects at least that I'm currently involved in. One, I'm beginning to dip into the world of assessment, which is new for me. So we're in the process of developing some assessments in literary reasoning for use at the high school level, including the development of a digital tool that we're calling Sense Making in the Disciplines. It's part of an IES-funded project that I'm engaged in. And I would say on the sense making in the discipline, this digital tool that we're developing, I think is very, it's not intended necessarily as an assessment tool. It's more intended as a scaffolding tool, but it's very much rooted in connecting kids as readers with prior knowledge and experiences that they develop out of their everyday lives in support of literary reasoning. And so the ways in which we'll be trying to document the unfolding and use of that tool, I think, is relevant to the mission, if you will, of CREA. And we're also involved in a longitudinal study in a high school here in Chicago of relationships between ethnic identity and social and emotional development and literacy outcomes. We're taking a human development perspective as well as a cultural and cognition perspective on this work. And we are evaluating, we have external and internal evaluations of that program. And again, I think that project is consistent with the goals and mission of CREA.
Great, thank you. What are your goals for participating in the CREA conference as a panelist? What were your goals?
Well, as I indicated in the speech that I just gave, that I don't formally work in the world of assessment and evaluation. So for me, it was a bit of border crossing, and I think that intellectual border crossing is interesting. I actually had concluded my speech suggesting that if we're going to develop formative and diagnostic assessments in education that are able to capture the multiple pathways through which young people can display knowledge and understanding, that I think it's going to require professional ongoing collaborations between communities of folks like myself who examine issues of culture and cognition, and people in the world that I think represents CREA, who look at evaluation and measurement and assessment.
Thank you. What do you hope your audience learned from your talk?
I hope that the audience learned, or at least thought about the complexities of human cognition, that is the ways in which people, students in school, or my objects of interest, recruit and coordinate multiple resources that have to do with ways of using language, sense making in everyday contexts, relationship building between teachers and students in classrooms. I tried to illustrate that in some of the examples that I provided, with the challenge to that community to say that how we think about sort of capturing and analyzing this knowledge unfolding inside practice is an important goal, I think, for the community of CREA. And I had hoped that I sparked some interest in that question.
Great, thank you. How do you did allude this to this already? How do you see these schools serving the mission of CREA, and how do you see these schools serving the broader mission or vision of cultural competence and responsiveness in education, or perhaps more broadly in research or evaluation?
You have to repeat that one for me.
The last one?
No, the question.
What do you hope your audience, how do you see these schools serving the mission?
These schools, when you say what schools?
Goals.
Goals. I'm sorry. Okay.
It's okay. So the goals of CREA, and also the goals serving the broader mission or vision of cultural competence and responsiveness in education, or perhaps more broadly in research or evaluation.
I'm still really not following that question.
So we'll do one. How do you see these schools serving the mission of CREA? And we were talking about, this is right after you shared, what do you feel the audience learned from your session this morning?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm actually answering the question, because I'm still not sure I understand it, but I would say that I think that if we're going to develop assessments and forms of evaluation of programs in education, at least, that are able, that don't serve what I think is the current role of essentializing outcomes that label young people and label teachers and label schools in negative lights, because we don't have readily available tools, especially tools that are knowledgeable and accessible, if you will, for example, to school districts or to policymakers at different levels of the system. That as a profession, then we are contributing to the inequities in opportunity to learn that many of us argue, we want to wrestle against. And so the need, I think, to have more professional collaborations and intellectual border crossing, because I don't think the kind of assessments and program evaluation, for example, that we've been talking about and that I think CREA advocates is possible without collaborations with people who work in studying learning in the disciplines, who study learning in informal settings, people who study the role of everyday knowledge in learning new things, people in the world of human development who think about how the demands of learning change based on where you are in the life course, that human beings are very complex. I have a new grandbaby, she's 2.5, and as I observe her, it is the most fascinating for me to realize all the complex learning that is going on right now, and to recognize that she will not be a fully developed, if you will, human being until she's 18 or 19 years old, would suggest that as human beings, we're pretty complex animals, right? And the world in which we live is a pretty complex system. And if you're going to try to understand that complexity, because it is so multidimensional, you have to have resources from across, I would argue, multiple disciplines, multiple perspectives, multiple institutional configurations in order to try to get a handle on it.
Thank you.
You have more?
One more. So finally, what vision, aspirations, or tactics do you have for CREA?
Well, I hope that CREA can serve as a catalyst for the kind of intellectual border crossing that I've just talked about. That it will invite collaborations from people involved in research across disciplines, across sites, and across national borders. One of the things that has been very impressive to me about the conference is its international presence, as I could see from the program booklet. And again, I think that we, even in our attention to issues of culture and learning in the United States, we're still often very U.S. centric and not paying sufficient attention to how issues of diversity along multiple dimensions manifest themselves in virtually every nation across the country.
Thank you.
Thank you.